I think it's important to understand that Joseph Smith, of course, wrote all of these accounts or dictated these accounts of the first vision several years after the very fact that they occurred. The first one he recorded was in 1832. He also recorded another one in 1835, and one in 1838, and one in 1842. So there are 4 accounts of the first vision, and historians and scholars acknowledge they are all different. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're not all true. We have to remember it would have been wonderful if Joseph Smith would have come home from the Sacred Grove and actually written his experience. But he was young. He was only 14. He's not a record keeper. And so when he finally does commit these to writing, he's going to be older, and he's going to have to rely on his long-term memory. Professionals usually would say and agree upon the idea that individuals who have these eyewitness experience, their understanding of that experience is going to change over time as they mature, as they have an enlarged understanding of the experience that they had. An eyewitness has an experience and repeats it the same way each time. It's probably evidence that this person has rehearsed that account. And certainly Joseph Smith's accounts are very spontaneous. They're generated from that very time and experience that he's undergoing in his life at that time. The 1832 account is a very, very significant account. And of course, this is given 12 years after the fact of the actual experience. In 1830, the very day the church was organized, Joseph Smith was told to keep a record. And yet he took a couple more years before he got going at it. But it's interesting, as he began his, what we call the 1832 history, one of the first things he begins to write about is his first vision. And in that account, it's a very, very personal, introspective account. He's not intending this to be for the world. It's in a private journal, and I'm sure Joseph Smith did not anticipate years later that many, many people would look at this and examine this account, because again, it's a very personal sort of narrative. And what's so interesting about this narrative is he mentions this marvelous theophany, but he makes no mention of the Father appearing. The 1832 account describes Joseph Smith's desire for forgiveness of sin. He certainly wants salvation. He wants redemption. He wants a cleansed soul. And in the account, he addresses the Savior addresses him and forgives him of his sins. And so one can understand that the focus of this account is on Joseph's forgiveness of sins, and the Savior granted that. Joseph doesn't mention the Father was not there. He just doesn't mention him. And I think that's a very significant point. It doesn't mean he wasn't there. It just means that the message that he received at that time was the forgiveness of sins from the Savior, with whom the dialogue or the conversation was taking place. In 1835, Joseph Smith shares another brief narrative account of the first vision with a man by the name of Robert Matthews. He's sometimes known as Joshua the Jewish minister, or he even went by another pseudonym named Matthias. But in this account, Joseph is obviously having a conversation with this individual, and obviously the experience of Joseph Smith came up, and Joseph decided to share this account with him. Again, this is kind of a one-on-one account, not again probably intended for a public audience, or Joseph probably never thought this would be widely read. But his scribe, Warren Parrish, wrote it down. And it provides wonderful details about the first vision, some of the elements and major points that are quite interesting. But again, a different audience, a different time, a different purpose. Same thing could be said of the 1838 account. At this point in time, Joseph Smith wants to write this account and wants it public. He is intending to publish it. He says, I'm doing this to disabuse the public mind of many of the problems and false reports that have been said about me and about Mormonism and my experiences. So this account is very, very important because he actually intended to publish it. So hence, this one's much more detailed, much more specific, and much more exhaustive. It's the longest account. I think it's the best account, but it is much different than the 32 account, the 35 account, and in 1842, Joseph Smith will actually write and compose another account. This one was for John Wentworth, who was an editor of a newspaper, but John Wentworth had written Joseph Smith and asked him to write some experiences of his spiritual life and the early history of the church for a man by the name of George Barstow, who's a friend of Wentworth. And Barstow was going to put these experiences or this account in a book that he was writing. So again, this account, which has become known as the Wentworth letter or the Wentworth account, the 1842 account, again, was written for a public audience. Joseph intended people to read it. So there's no question that audience is a big factor in the differing accounts and why they're different, simply because Joseph Smith has a different audience who he's directing his experiences for and to. Depending on the audience will also determine what details come out in the narrative. For example, again, I think Joshua, the Jewish minister, is probably questioning Joseph Smith as to his validity as a prophet. Meaning, if you're a Jewish person, someone who is defined as a prophet is someone like Moses who saw God. Well, so Joseph goes, okay, yes, I claim to be a prophet. The reason I claim to be a prophet is, yes, I've seen God. Let me tell you about it. So he was a little more expressive, a little more open with the idea that, hey, I have seen deity.